There were 7 of them, 7 enormous stone pillars drifting at the edge of the solar system, each one carved from a material that no modern engineer had ever been able to identify. They were not metal, they were not rock, they were something between the two, dense, dark, and impossibly old. Each pillar was wide enough that a large warship could not see both sides at once. Each one was tall enough to cast a shadow across an entire moon if a sun had been close enough to shine on it. And every surface of every pillar, from its flat base to its tapered top, was covered in text. The writing had been carved deep, not scratched or painted, but pressed into the stone with something that must have generated enormous force. There were over 500 distinct languages represented across the 7 pillars. Some of those languages were still spoken by living civilizations. Some had not been heard aloud in thousands of years. A few had no known speakers anywhere in the catalogued galaxy and could only be read by machines trained on ancient archives. But every inscription said the same thing. This system is protected under the Accord of Varath. The world within is sealed by mutual agreement. Do not approach, do not scan, do not disturb, do not attempt contact or extraction. If you are reading this, you already know who placed these markers. If you do not know, then you are too young to be here. Turn back. There is nothing in this system worth what you will pay for it. Fleet Admiral Gorruvak of the Thessian Collective read the nearest pillar from the forward observation window of his command vessel, the Sovereign Patience, and said nothing for a long time. He was a large creature by Thessian standards, with wide shoulders that filled his uniform, and a reputation for patience that had earned him his ship's name during the campaign in the outer reaches. He was not impulsive, he was not foolish. He had survived 40 years of military service by being neither of those things. He looked at the pillar for 3 minutes, then he ordered his fleet to advance. The Thessian Collective was an empire of 47 worlds spread across 6 star systems. It had existed for 2,000 years in its current form, though its roots went back twice that far. It was not the largest empire in the known galaxy, but it was among the most organized, the most methodical, and the most confident in its own judgment. It had absorbed 12 smaller civilizations in the past 800 years, not always gently, and it had learned from each of those experiences that the universe rewarded boldness far more reliably than caution. The quarantine on this system was old. The Accord of Varath was so old that most Thessian historians treated it as a founding document rather than a living law. The civilization that had negotiated that accord, the Varath Assembly, had dissolved long before the Collective was born. The civilization on the other side of the agreement, the one that had supposedly made the choice to seal itself away, was listed in every record as extinct. 12,000 years of silence from a species was not a pause, it was an ending. Gorruvak was here because his long-range geological surveys had detected extraordinary mineral concentrations in the 3rd planet of this system, the kind of concentrations that could sustain a collective expansion program for a century, the kind that his Senate had sent him specifically to find. The pillars were a relic of an agreement between dead civilizations. The world below was unclaimed. The resources were needed. The math was simple. His science lead, a meticulous older officer named Druvasath, had placed the full archive file on his desk that morning. The file was long. It ran to several hundred pages of densely written text, compiled from historical records across multiple civilizations that had interacted with this system over the millennia. Gorruvak had read the executive summary. He had found it dramatic and unconvincing in equal measure. He had set it aside and made his decision. Druvasath had watched him make that decision in silence. She had been watching him in that particular silence, the one she used when she had something important to say and had decided not to say it, since early that morning. She was very good at that silence. Gorruvak was very good at ignoring it. The third planet came into view, and even he was quiet for a moment. It was blue. Not the pale gray blue of a cold gas world, not the harsh electric blue of an ionized atmosphere, but a warm, deep, living blue, the color of oceans seen from very far away. It had patches of green and brown where land rose above the water. It had white clouds moving slowly in long curving bands. It glowed against the black of space the way something alive glows when it does not know anyone is watching it. It looked peaceful. It looked small. It looked like exactly the kind of world that the Collective had claimed 16 times before without difficulty. Gorruvak ordered the geological survey to begin. The survey required sending calibration pulses into the ground, sharp bursts of directed energy that would ripple through the rock and return information about what was buried below. The pulses were not weapons. They would register on the surface as moderate ground tremors, which was unfortunate but unavoidable. He selected 3 sites in what appeared to be uninhabited wilderness and sent the order. The pulses fired. 6,000 kilometers from the nearest impact point, a woman named Tiva Oshiro was standing on the porch of her house in a rural valley, watching the late afternoon light change on the hills. She was a farmer and a practical person who spent very little time worrying about things she could not do anything about. When the ground moved under her feet, she went still. She felt the direction of it, the way it had come from above rather than below, and she looked up at the sky. The sky was empty and pale and said nothing. Tiva went back inside. She sat down at her kitchen table. She turned on the radio. She was not the only one asking questions. Within hours, the questions had reached people who could begin finding answers, and quietly, without any announcement, without any drama, a world that had been asleep in one particular way for a very long time began, in that same particular way, to slowly open its eyes. The emergency session of the Thessian Collective's High Archive was called without prior notice at 4 in the morning local capital time. This was unusual. The High Archive was an institution of great dignity and very regular hours. The 6 senior archivists who found themselves summoned to its main chamber in the dark of early morning arrived looking tired and concerned in roughly equal measure. The person who had summoned them was a junior researcher named Sovi Yaren. She was 26 years old. She had been in her position for 14 months. She had spent the previous 18 hours reading the full archive file on the quarantine system, the one that Fleet Admiral Gorruvak had received and set aside. When the senior archivists were seated, she placed a single printed page on the table in front of each of them. It contained 1 paragraph. She had selected it from page 342 of the full file because she felt that if 1 paragraph could stand for everything, it was this one. The paragraph described the wake condition. The oldest archivist in the room, a scholar named Vorath Keln, who had spent 60 years studying the periods before the Collective existed, read the paragraph. Then he put the page down, folded his hands, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The other 5 archivists read their copies and sat with varying expressions of discomfort. "The fleet has already fired the calibration pulses," she said. She said it quietly, without accusation, just as a fact. No one spoke for a while. The archive file told a story that most Thessian citizens knew in the way they knew mythology, the broad outlines, the dramatic moments, without the weight of believing it was literally true. The story went like this. 12,000 years ago, the third planet in the quarantine system had been home to a civilization that called itself human. These humans had been spacefaring for several centuries. They were not the most technologically advanced species in the galaxy at that time, nor the most numerous, nor the oldest. By every conventional measurement, they were a mid-tier civilization that had been expanding for a few hundred years and showed ordinary signs of growth. The Thessian historians who studied that period had noted that conventional measurements consistently failed to capture what the humans actually were. The humans had fought 4 interstellar wars before the quarantine. In 3 of those wars, they were the smaller side. They had faced civilizations with more ships, more experience, and longer histories of organized military conflict. In every case, those civilizations had been certain that the humans would eventually exhaust their capacity to fight and accept terms. In every case, that certainty had been wrong. The analysis that had been written into the archive file, compiled from sources across 6 different civilizations that either fought the humans or observed them being fought, kept returning to the same conclusion. It was not that humans were indestructible. They took tremendous losses. Their ships burned, and their people died at the same rate as anyone else. It was something else. Something about how they related to loss that the other civilizations could not model correctly. Every military doctrine in the known galaxy was built on the concept of the breaking threshold, the point at which the calculation of continuing to fight became irrational for any reasonable species. You applied enough force, you caused enough damage, and eventually the cost of continuing became greater than any possible gain. At that point, a rational civilization sued for peace or withdrew. Human military doctrine appeared to contain no such threshold. When they took losses, they did not recalculate whether to continue. They recalculated how to continue differently. When a strategy failed them, they did not pull back to consider whether fighting was still worth it. They changed the strategy and pressed forward. The archive file contained a line from a Valkorath military analyst writing 12,000 years ago, just before the Valkorath had agreed to seek peace after 3 centuries of conflict with the humans. The line read, "We have searched our models for the point at which they will stop. We have now concluded that the point does not exist. They will not stop. They will only change. We are seeking terms." The Valkorath were not the only ones. The Surath Dominion had fought the humans for 160 years before asking for peace. The Gren Conclave had lasted 90 years. Each civilization had gone in believing that superior numbers and technology would decide the outcome. Each civilization had discovered that human psychology did not operate the way the models predicted. The final war, the one that ended with the quarantine, had been started by the largest empire of that era, the Keth sovereignty. The Keth had studied all 3 previous wars carefully. They had believed they understood the humans better than anyone. They had launched what they described as a final campaign, designed to be overwhelming and swift. It had lasted 420 years. At the end of those 420 years, the Keth sovereignty had asked for peace, not because they had been militarily destroyed, because they were exhausted at a civilizational level, in a way that went below politics and below economy and into something structural. The spirit, if a civilization could be said to have one, had simply given out. And the humans, after 4 centuries of conflict, had been, if the records were accurate, getting better at it, not worse. The piece the humans had agreed to was the part that confused every historian who studied it. They had not demanded reparations. They had not annexed territory. They had agreed to a voluntary regression. Their spacefaring technology would be disabled. Their memory of galactic civilization would be allowed to fade across generations. Their world would be sealed under a long quarantine. In return, they had asked simply to be left alone to live in peace. Why a victorious species would agree to this had been debated for millennia. The most common theory, noted in the archive file with some uncertainty, was that the humans had grown genuinely uninterested in the war. They had solved it. It was no longer presenting them with problems worth engaging. They had chosen to find something else to do. The final detail, the one Sophie had underlined when she first read the file, and that now sat at the center of this dark, silent room in the early morning, was the wake condition. Written into the original accord and confirmed by 7 independent historical sources, it stated that the regression was not permanent. It was designed as a sleep, not a death. And the condition under which the sleep would end was clearly written: external aggression on home territory. The calibration pulses had already fired. They had hit the surface with the force of ground tremors across several locations. Gorruvak had fired them hours ago. Vorath Kelm looked at Sophie across the table. His expression was very calm, the calm of someone who had spent a lifetime reading about catastrophes and had developed a stillness in the face of them. "How quickly can we reach the Admiral?" he asked. "His communications are routed through the fleet command channel," Sophie said. "We can reach him within an hour." "Send the message," Vorath Kelm said. "Send him the full file. Mark it urgent. Mark it critical. Mark it every word we have for important." He paused. "And pray that he is faster at reading than he was this morning." On the surface of the blue planet far below, a retired aerospace engineer named Dr. Bram Calloway was sitting at the desk in his home study at 2 in the morning, staring at the whiteboard in front of him. He had woken from a dream 40 minutes ago. He could not remember the dream. What he could remember, what he had not been able to stop writing since the moment his eyes opened, was filling the board in front of him from one edge to the other. He recognized parts of what he had written. The underlying physics was familiar. The mathematics were things he had studied, though never assembled in quite this configuration before. But the overall architecture of it was something he had never read, never been taught, and never, to his knowledge, imagined. It was a design for a faster-than-light drive, a complete one, not theoretical, not sketch-level, a working design with tolerances, material specifications, and step-by-step assembly guidance. His hands were steady. That was the strange part. They were not shaking. He looked at the board for a long time, and then, with the calm practicality of a man who had spent his career solving engineering problems, he picked up his phone. He called a colleague. He said, "I need you to come and see something. I think something has come back to me, and I do not think I am the only one." He was right. Across the planet, in the same night, in different time zones and different cities and different small towns, other people were waking up, not with fear, not with confusion, with purpose. Something very old had been triggered by those pulses, something that had been waiting, deep and patient, for exactly this moment. It was beginning, quietly and without ceremony, to surface. 6 months after the calibration pulses, the planet below was different in a way that Drvisoth could see from orbit but could not properly explain in any report she had written.
The geography was the same, the cities were the same, the oceans and the mountain ranges and the river systems were exactly as they had been when the fleet first arrived. But there was something in the pattern of activity that had changed so completely and so quickly that her analysis systems kept flagging anomalies and then running out of categories to put them in. She stood at the observation window every morning with her notes and watched the surface through the long-range optical feeds. The energy output of the planet had increased by an amount that would have taken most civilizations 2 or 3 generations to achieve. It had happened in 6 months. Construction was ongoing at hundreds of sites simultaneously. Not the construction of buildings or roads, but of large, flat, reinforced structures in remote areas, the kind of structures that her recognition software could not classify because they did not match any known construction type in the Collective's database. The closest match, which the software offered with very low confidence, was launch infrastructure. She brought this to Gorruvak. He looked at the scan data, noted that the humans had no knowledge of space travel, and reminded her that a pre-contact civilization building structures on the ground did not constitute a threat to a fleet in high orbit. She went back to her console and opened her personal log and began recording everything the scanners reported, every data point, every anomaly, every reading that didn't fit. She did not know why she felt the need to do this. It was just a feeling that later she would want the record to be complete. The truth of what was happening on the surface was something no Thessian analyst could have built a model for, because it did not operate through any structure they would recognize as a system. There was no single government program directing it. There was no secret facility. There was no brilliant individual in a hidden laboratory who had worked it all out. There were simply people, everywhere, waking up with knowledge they had not possessed when they went to sleep. A machinist in a large port city sketched the complete internal architecture of a gravitational shielding unit during his lunch break. He had no engineering degree. He worked with his hands. He stared at what he had drawn for 20 minutes before walking it to the nearest university and handing it through the front door. A 16-year-old student in a coastal town filled 12 handwritten notebooks with propulsion mathematics in a single weekend, checked every line 3 times over the following 2 days, found no errors, and uploaded the full contents to a public research database with a note that said simply, "I don't know where this came from, but it works." A retired military pilot woke from a long, strange dream and began drawing weapons guidance systems that were more sophisticated than anything currently in any nation's active arsenal. It was happening everywhere, and it was accelerating. Whatever had been buried in the human mind across 12,000 years of engineered forgetting was returning the way air returns to a space that had been holding its breath. Not cautiously, not gradually, all at once and with great force and without asking permission. The Unified Emergency Council, formed in the first days after the fleet was detected, made a practical decision early on. Rather than trying to manage the flood of new knowledge from the top down, they opened a simple system. Anyone with an idea submitted it. Teams formed around the best ideas rapidly, and resources went where results were happening, rather than where rank or seniority directed them. It was loud and complicated, and generated arguments every day. It also moved faster than any of them had ever been part of. The scout reconnaissance unit that had been captured and tied to a fence post by a farmer named Teva Oshiro, she had come back for it after she filed her report, retrieved it from the field, and driven it to the nearest research center in the back of her truck, was assembled in a government facility within 2 weeks. Within 10 weeks, a team drawn from across 7 countries, with backgrounds ranging from deep-sea engineering to veterinarian medicine, had taken it apart down to its smallest component, understood how each piece functioned, and begun building a propulsion system from materials available on Earth. The first 3 attempts did not work. The 4th produced an engine that ran for 11 seconds before burning out. The 5th ran for 4 minutes. By the end of 4 months, they had a stable propulsion system. By the end of 5 months, they had defensive shielding built on the same principles as those observed in the collective ships from passive sensor data. By the end of 6 months, they had weapons, and the tone in every research facility had shifted from urgent to something quieter and more deliberate. Then, Gorruvak made his mistake.
He had received a firm communication from the High Archive at the Collective Capital, routed urgently through every channel Soviarn's team could reach. It contained the full file. It contained a very direct request to cease all activity in the system and begin withdrawal. Gorruvak read the message summary. He found it, as he had found the archive file that morning 6 months ago, dramatic and unconvincing. He sent a polite acknowledgement and then ordered the destruction of a cluster of communication satellites in high orbit. He framed it to himself as a demonstration, a controlled action to remind the surface that the difference in capability between a spacefaring empire and a pre-contact world was not a small gap to be bridged by enthusiasm. 3 human technicians who had been performing scheduled maintenance aboard one of the satellites were killed in the strike. The Human Council's response arrived 4 hours later. It was short. It named all 3 people who had died. It stated clearly that this was considered an act of aggression against human lives. It informed the fleet that the Council considered a state of active conflict to exist between the human world and the Thessian Collective from that moment forward. And then, all communication channels went quiet. Druvasov read the statement at her console and sat very still for a while. It was not the statement itself that frightened her. It was the tone. There was no grief performed for effect. There was no anger. There was no attempt to make the collective feel guilty or afraid. There was simply a line, drawn with complete precision, and on the other side of that line, something was preparing to move. She made her decision that same night. A junior intelligence analyst named Ovrath Say had been at the Collective Capital for the entire 6 months, watching the situation from a distance and growing more alarmed with each report. She had been in the session where Vorath Keln and the other senior archivists had first discussed the wake condition. She had watched every warning in the archive file arrive, one after another, exactly as described, while the fleet dismissed each one. She was not a soldier. She was a careful, methodical researcher who spent most of her time reading old texts in quiet buildings. But she had read the file, all of it, and she understood what was coming in a way that Gorruvak, who had read only the summary, did not. She packed a small travel case. She wrote a short note to her supervisor explaining what she was doing and why. She boarded an emergency transport to the fleet's resupply station, and from there, she found her way to a single-occupant escape capsule and aimed it at the planet below. The descent was violent. The capsule shook hard enough that she could not tell if it was breaking apart or simply fighting through atmosphere. She kept her eyes closed and her hands flat on her knees and focused on breathing slowly. The impact, when it came, knocked her unconscious for several minutes. When she opened her eyes, she was looking up at an overcast gray sky through a cracked viewport. Several humans in heavy outdoor clothing were standing around the capsule, looking at her through the window with expressions that were cautious but not threatening. She was helped out carefully. She was wrapped in a thick blanket. She was given a warm drink that smelled unfamiliar and tasted of something she could not identify, but that was genuinely calming. Then she was driven in a quiet vehicle to a low building where a human official was waiting for her at a table. His name was Ambassador Rail Chandra. He introduced himself simply, asked if she needed anything further before they spoke, and then sat back and waited with a patience that had no performance in it. It was simply real. She told him everything: the full archive file, the high archive session, the wake condition, the size of the collective fleet, not just the 47 ships currently in orbit, but the full collective military, 4,300 warships. She told him because she wanted him to understand exactly what was coming, to understand the scale of it, so that whatever decision he made it with complete information. Rael listened without interrupting. Then he looked at her with a calm, clear expression and said, "Thank you. That is very useful to know. We had some concern this might resolve too quickly." Ovrath stared at him. She had expected fear. She had expected the number 4,300 to produce some visible change in him. There was nothing. There was just that same patient, steady attention. She spent the rest of that day in a small room with a window looking out onto a gray and rocky landscape, drinking warm drinks and wondering, in a very genuine and uncomfortable way, whether the humans were confident because they understood something she did not, or simply because they had not yet grasped what they were facing. By the end of that first conversation, she was beginning to suspect the former. 3 weeks later, the first human spacecraft launched. It had been a cargo freighter in its previous life, a battered and unglamorous vehicle built to move heavy equipment between ports. The crew had stripped it to the frame, reinforced the hull with the new plating, fitted 8 rail cannons at angles that no professional military architect would have designed, and installed the new propulsion system in a space that was technically too small for it. The whole vessel looked exactly what it was, something built fast by people who decided that how it looked was not the priority. The 11 crew members who volunteered to fly it were a mix of former military pilots, structural engineers, a deep-sea welder, and Teva Oshiro, the farmer who had captured the reconnaissance unit in her field 9 months earlier, and since become, somewhat to her own surprise, a person that the council wanted on every important project. She had been asked formally if she would join the first crew. She had said yes without hesitation, then gone home to tend her animals and pack a bag. They named the ship the Unrelenting Argument. The council had gently suggested a more formal name. The crew thanked them and kept the one they had chosen. The Unrelenting Argument launched on a cold, clear morning and was in the outer system within hours. 2 collective warships on patrol detected it immediately and identified it as a primitive improvised vessel. Their commander sent a brief dismissive report to the flagship and moved to intercept. The engagement lasted 37 minutes. When it ended, both collective warships were drifting, their systems disabled, their crews alive but their ships unable to maneuver. The Unrelenting Argument had taken damage to one side and lost 2 of its cannons. All 11 crew members were alive. Teva Oshiro, who had been operating the targeting systems, sent a short message back to the surface. It became, within a day, the phrase that every human alive seemed to know. 2 down. Tell them to send more. We're just getting started. On the bridge of his flagship, Gorruvak stared at the engagement report for a long time without speaking. Then he went to his cabin and for the first time opened the full archive file. He read it from the first page to the last without stopping. When he finished, he sat in the silence of his cabin and looked at the wall. Outside, the blue-green planet turned slowly in the dark, patient, alive, waiting. He understood now what Druvasov was trying to tell him. He understood what the pillars at the edge of the system had meant. He understood why no one had entered this system in 12,000 years.
And he understood with a cold and absolute certainty that whatever came next was going to be unlike anything the collective had ever faced, because the humans were not frightened. They were not uncertain. They were not fighting because they had to. They were fighting because something old and proud and enormously capable had been woken up, and it remembered, somewhere deeper than words, exactly what it was. The galaxy had been warned.
The signs had been there for 12,000 years, carved into stone in 500 languages, drifting patiently at the edge of the dark. Every word of every inscription had said the same thing, and every word had been true. Some things are not extinct. Some things are only sleeping. And the worst thing you can do, the absolute worst thing you can do, is be the one who wakes them up. 2 years after the calibration pulses, the Thessian Collective Senate voted to send everything it had. The debate had been long and loud. The elder senators, those who had spent their careers in the deep records, who had read about the periods before the collective existed, who knew the archive file not as a summary but as the full document it was, had argued against escalation with everything they had. Vorath Keln had stood at the front of the chamber and spoken for 2 hours about what the file said, about what history said, about the specific and very well-documented record of direct military escalation against this species had produced every single time it had been tried. The younger senators had listened. They had considered his words with what looked like genuine respect, and then they had voted for escalation anyway. They had the numbers, they had the confidence, and they had, in their calculation, more than enough ships to settle the matter decisively. 4,300 collective warships gathered at the outer edge of the quarantine zone. They formed a layered formation that stretched across thousands of kilometers. Supply ships moved along the edges. Medical vessels and repair units held position at the rear. Troop carriers waited with ground forces ready for surface operations once the orbital battle was concluded. Every projection, every model, every analyst who reviewed the assembled force came to the same conclusion. This would be over quickly. The human fleet that rose from the planet numbered 600 ships. When the collective's long-range sensors confirmed that figure, there was a moment of genuine puzzlement across multiple command bridges. Analysts ran the count twice. 600 against 4,300? The ratio was so wide that some commanders initially assumed the 600 were a distraction. Something else had to be happening elsewhere, a diversionary force, while the real threat approached from a different direction. But the 600 came forward steadily and without hesitation on a direct intercept course, and it became clear as they closed the distance that there was no other force. This was simply what the humans had chosen to bring. What followed became known later as the engagement at the outer markers, named for the 7 ancient stone pillars that had watched it all from a distance, their inscriptions still legible, their warning still perfect, still unheeded. It lasted 12 days. In the first 2 days, the collective's advantage in numbers was significant and visible. Human ships were hit hard, formations were broken apart, several of the larger vessels were destroyed in the opening hours, and the collective officers watching the engagement feeds felt the steady comfort of a force doing precisely what it had been built and trained to do. The projections said that the human fleet would reach unsustainable losses by day 3 and begin pulling back by day 4. Day 3 arrived. The human fleet did not pull back. It reorganized. This was the moment that began to unsettle the collective commanders who were watching from the command ships further back. When a human formation was scattered by a collective strike, the surviving ships did not drift. They did not wait for orders from a central command vessel. They found each other, adjusted, and engaged the nearest collective ships using whatever they currently had, adapting their approach to what was directly in front of them rather than to any standing plan. When a human command ship was destroyed, and several were, the surrounding vessels showed no collapse of coordination. They continued. The loss was real, and it mattered, and no one on board those ships was unaffected by it. But it did not create the structural failure the collective's models had predicted, because the human fleet had been designed to function without central command if central command was lost. They had planned for their own worst outcomes before the battle began.
By day 5, the collective commanders had stopped consulting their battle projections. The projections kept being wrong. They were revised, and then they were wrong again, and continuing to rely on them was becoming more disorienting than useful. On day 7, a human tactic emerged that no analyst had modeled, and no model would have predicted. A large portion of the human fleet, roughly 1/3 of the remaining ships, began withdrawing, not in disorder, not in panic, a controlled, deliberate pullback that drew a significant section of the collective fleet forward and away from the main formation. The collective commanders read it as breaking. The order came down to press the advantage and pursue. The pursuing force flew for several hours through what felt like a clean chase. Then, from 8 different directions simultaneously, human ships that had been running dark and silent in the surrounding space came alive. The trap closed from every side at once. The pursuing collective force found itself at the center of a prepared ambush zone that had been placed hours before the retreat began, using precise coordination and a willingness to leave a large number of ships in a passive waiting role during the most brutal phase of the battle. Ships that had sat silent while their colleagues were hit and destroyed in the retreat, holding their positions with absolute discipline because they had been told the long-term result would justify it. Every military model in the collective's database rated the probability of this tactic from a smaller force at less than 1%. The models had assumed that no rational command structure would order its own people into a punishing retreat as a deliberate component of strategy, knowing that ships would be destroyed during the retreat phase. The models had been built on the assumption that the species using them thought about acceptable loss the way every other species did. They did not. On the 8th day, Gorruvak stood at his bridge display with the expression of someone who had understood something far too late. His fleet was still large, it was still fighting, but it was no longer controlling the battle in any meaningful way. Everywhere his commanders pressed an advantage, they found it turning. Everywhere they expected the humans to give ground, the humans held and struck back. Everywhere they created an opening, something came through it that made the situation worse. Overath Say was standing in the human command center on the surface, watching the same battle from the other side. She stood beside Ambassador Rael Chandra at a long display cable and watched the tactical feeds with wide, still eyes. She had read the archive file. She had understood it intellectually, but reading about a thing and watching it happen in real time were not the same experience at all. She turned to Rael and spoke quietly. "Every species I know of, when it goes to war, asks whether it can win," she said. "Your people seem to ask something different. You ask how long it will take. It is a completely different question. I didn't understand what that meant until right now." Rael looked at the display for a moment. "Losing is not something we spend much time planning for," he said simply. Then he picked up his communication device and went back to work.
By day 9, the Collective had lost nearly a third of its ships. Not all destroyed, many were damaged, withdrawn, or cut off from the main formation and unable to rejoin effectively. The fleet was still substantial, but the commanders were tired in a way that went deeper than the fatigue of battle, a tiredness that the human side showed no sign of sharing. If anything, as the days passed, the human fleet's coordination seemed to be improving, as if the conflict itself was teaching them something, and they were absorbing the lesson faster than the Collective could adapt to what they were learning. It was on the 10th day that Gorruvak received word from his surface intelligence team about what the humans were doing on the planet below. The construction at hundreds of sites had not slowed, it had accelerated. Whatever resources the humans were committing to the battle in space, they were simultaneously committing more to something happening on the ground. New facilities, new production lines, new research centers staffed with people working without stop, in shifts that ran through every hour of the day and night. They were not preparing for this battle to end. They were preparing for the next one.
On the 11th day, Gorruvak made a decision that he knew would end his career, but that he had concluded was the only decision left. He opened a communication channel to the Human Council on the surface. He did not use a coded military frequency. He used a broad civilian band, the kind of open channel that anyone with the right equipment could hear. He did it in the open because he wanted the record to be clear. He wanted there to be no ambiguity about what had happened or why. He stated his name and his rank. He stated that he was speaking on behalf of the Thessian Collective fleet in this system, though not on behalf of the Senate that had sent him, because the Senate had been wrong, and he was no longer willing to pretend otherwise. He stated that the Collective fleet was halting offensive operations immediately. He stated that his ships would hold position and make no further hostile movements, and that he was requesting a direct communication with whoever on the surface was authorized to speak for the human world. There was a silence of about 4 minutes. Then Rael Chandra's voice came back through the channel. It was calm. It was clear. It said, "We heard you. We are watching your ships. If they remain still, we will speak." They remained still. The conversation that followed lasted 6 hours. It was conducted by communication relay, with Avrath Say on the surface translating where needed, which was often. Rael sat across a table from a communication device and spoke with the same patient clarity he brought to every conversation. The Human Council sent representatives who arrived in the room quietly and without ceremony, sat down and participated in the discussion with the same focused practicality that seemed to characterize how these people approached every problem. What was decided was not simple. Nothing about the situation was simple. Gorruvak would return to the Collective capital with his remaining fleet. He would face the Senate and present them with the full reality of what had happened, not the version that would be easiest to hear, but the true version, documented and complete. He would do this knowing that the Senate might not thank him for it. He would do it because the alternative, continuing a conflict that the archive file had told them 12,000 years ago could not be won through force, was not something he was willing to be responsible for. The humans asked for 3 things. They were direct and specific. The first was that the quarantine pillars at the edge of the system be removed.
They had been placed there at the end of a peace agreement with a civilization that no longer existed. They were not a protection. They were a door left unlocked, and unlocked doors invited the wrong people to try them. If the humans were going to rejoin the galactic community, they intended to do it on open terms. The second was that the full archive file be made publicly available throughout the collective and, through the collective's trade and diplomatic networks throughout the known galaxy, not as a historical curiosity, as a practical document, as something that any civilization considering interaction with Earth could read before making decisions. The third was time. Specifically, they asked for 40 years of non-interference, not because they needed to be protected, because there was work to do, and they preferred to do it in their own way, on their own schedule. The knowledge that had surfaced in the last 2 years was only the beginning. There was much more to recover, to rebuild, and to understand. Rael framed this third request simply, without drama. We know who we are. We need time to remember it properly. Gorruvak agreed to all three. He did not have the authority to commit the Senate to these terms. He said so honestly, but he would return and argue for them with everything he had, and his personal record and the battle data from the past 12 days would do a significant portion of the arguing for him. Before he left, he asked Druvasath to compile her full personal log, every data point she had recorded during the 6 months of monitoring. She handed it to him without a word. She had kept it for exactly this reason. The collective fleet withdrew in stages over 3 days, orderly, quiet. The human ships held position and watched them go, neither threatening nor celebrating, just watching. Teva Oshira stood at the viewport of the unrelenting argument as the last collective ships cleared the outer markers, and she looked at the 7 ancient stone pillars drifting in the cold dark, and thought about the people who had carved them 12,000 years ago in 500 languages with one message. She thought about what it must have cost them to make that choice, to win a war and then choose to sleep rather than to keep going. She thought about what kind of people did that. The same kind who tie an alien drone to a fence post and go inside to drink coffee. The same kind who launch a cargo freighter into a war and name it the unrelenting argument. The same kind who wake up at 2 in the morning with equations on their hands and call their colleagues and say quietly and steadily, something has come back.
On the surface, Ovrath Sai was given a small apartment in a coastal city with a view of the ocean. She had been offered the option to return to the collective with Gorruvak's fleet. She had declined. She had read the archive file. She knew what the next 40 years were going to look like, and she intended to be present for them. She was sitting at her desk on the first morning after the fleet withdrew, looking out at the water, when Rael knocked on her open door. He came in and set a warm drink on her desk and sat down in the other chair. He looked at the ocean for a moment. "You're staying," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "You understand you're going to watch us become something quite different from what we are right now," he said. "I do," she said. "That's why I'm staying." He nodded. He picked up his own drink. They sat in silence for a while, looking at the water.
Outside, the city was alive and moving, and full of people who were working, building, remembering. Far across the galaxy, in the collective Senate chamber, a message was being delivered to a full session by a tired admiral who had earned the right to be listened to the hard way. He placed a data slate on the table in front of the assembled senators and said, before anyone else could speak, "I am going to ask you to read the full file, not the summary, the full file, and then I am going to tell you what the next 40 years need to look like, because I have been where you are about to decide to send another fleet, and I am asking you, as clearly as I know how to ask, do not." Vorath Keln, sitting near the back of the chamber at his usual seat, looked at Gorruvak across the room. He said nothing, but the look on his face was the look of a scholar who had spent 60 years hoping that someone would eventually listen, and who was not yet certain whether this was that moment, but was allowing himself carefully to begin to hope. And on the blue world below, which was no longer quiet in any way that it had been before, the work continued, quietly, practically, at enormous speed, with the focus of a people who had remembered something important about themselves. The 7 pillars drifted at the edge of the system, their inscriptions still legible in 500 languages, read now by no one who needed warning. The warning had already been given. It had been given 12,000 years ago, and again 6 months ago, and again at the end of a 12-day battle that had taken 4,000 ships to finally begin to teach. The message had always been the same. It had always been true. Do not wake what sleeps here. Because what sleeps here does not wake slowly, does not wake gently, does not wake uncertain of what it is or what it is capable of. What sleeps here wakes up ready, and it does not go back to sleep.